My grandson Andrew stood in my kitchen on a Sunday morning in October and said, "Grandpa, you don't need to worry about any of this anymore. I'm here now. Let me handle everything." He said it with the particular warmth of someone who has rehearsed the warmth. I know that sound. I spent 30 years running auction rooms where the most dangerous people in the space were never the ones who looked dangerous. They were the ones who looked helpful. The ones with the easy smiles and the practiced concern and the gentle hands on your shoulder that meant they had already decided what your property was worth and what they intended to pay for it. I looked at my grandson. I looked at his wife, Brianna, standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee and an expression of such practiced sympathy that I recognized it as the thing it was the moment I saw it. I said, "That's kind of you, Andrew." He said, "We want to be here for you, Grandpa. After everything with Grandma Ruth, you shouldn't have to manage all of this alone." I said, "I appreciate that." What I did not say was that I had been managing things for 61 years and was perfectly capable of continuing. What I did not say was that I had been watching him for 3 weeks and already knew, with the certainty that comes from 30 years of reading rooms and reading people, that this was not about managing anything for me. It was about 60 days. What Andrew did in those 60 days, and what I had been quietly doing while he did it. This is the story of what happens when a grandson mistakes his grandfather's silence for surrender. My name is Calvin Marsh. I am 72 years old. I was born in Abilene, Kansas, the son of a cattle auctioneer who could read a room of 200 bidders the way other men read a newspaper, quickly and completely and without missing anything that mattered. My father had a gift for understanding what things were actually worth as opposed to what people believed they were worth, which are two different numbers in almost every transaction, and he spent 40 years making his living in the space between those two numbers. I inherited his gift. The ability to stand in a room full of people and understand what was actually happening beneath the surface of what appeared to be happening. Who was nervous? Who was bluffing? Who had decided the outcome before the bidding started? I started Marsh Auction Services in Salina, Kansas in 1981 with a leased warehouse, a portable PA system, and a reputation built on 3 years of working estate sales for a larger firm in Wichita. I was 30 years old and I had nothing except the ability my father had given me, which was the ability to read a room accurately and to price things honestly. In this business, those two abilities are the same ability. We ran farm equipment auctions, industrial machinery sales, estate liquidations, and specialty auctions for collections that required someone who could accurately represent what was being sold. I was that person. I was never anything else. By the time I sold the business 6 years ago to a regional company out of Oklahoma City, Marsh Auction had 8 employees, a permanent facility on the east side of Salina, and a client list built on 30 years of transactions in which I had never once misrepresented the value of anything I put on the block. I sold for enough to retire without concern. The proceeds, combined with what Ruth and I had saved over 40 years of careful living, gave us a financial position that was solid in the particular way of people who have never spent money they did not have. Ruth passed 14 months ago. Congestive heart failure. Managed for 3 years and then not managed, the way these things go when the body decides it has reached the end of what medicine can maintain. She was 69 years old. We had been married for 46 years and she had been my partner in the business and in everything else, the person who kept the books and understood, better than anyone I have ever known, the particular kind of patience that running a small business in a small market requires. After Ruth passed, I stayed in the house on Claflin Road where we had lived for 28 years. I was not ready to leave it, and I did not see any reason why I should be required to become ready on anyone else's timeline. I have one child. My daughter Patricia lives in Denver with her husband and their 2 children and calls every week without fail. She has her mother's practicality and her mother's ability to assess a situation without sentimentality. My grandson Andrew is Patricia's son. He is 31 years old. He grew up in Denver and moved to Salina 4 years ago with his wife Brianna when he took a position managing logistics for a regional agricultural supply company. I was glad to have family closer. Ruth was alive then, and it was good for her to have Andrew nearby. What I did not understand until the weeks after Ruth's passing began to reveal it was that Andrew's relocation to Salina had not been as spontaneous as it appeared. Andrew is 31 years old. He has Patricia's organizational intelligence and none of Patricia's honesty about his motivations, which is the most important difference between them. He grew up watching me run Marsh auction. He spent summers in Salina as a teenager and understood that the auction operation had built something substantial. He knew about the retirement proceeds because his mother had mentioned them at a family dinner 3 years ago in the unguarded way of parents who have forgotten that their adult children are paying attention. Brianna is 29 years old, with a background in financial administration. She is pleasant and attentive and has, from the first time I met her, a specific quality of attention to detail in financial conversations that I recognized immediately as professional rather than personal. When someone asks the right questions in the right order about numbers they have no obvious reason to be interested in, that is not curiosity, that is preparation. The first time I noticed this was at a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago, before Ruth passed. When Brianna asked about the structure of the retirement account with the precision of someone who had looked up what questions to ask before arriving, Ruth noticed it too. Afterward in the kitchen she said quietly, "That girl is doing math that has nothing to do with cooking." I said I had noticed. We left it there because it was Thanksgiving and because Andrew seemed happy. After Ruth passed, things moved faster. The first sign came 3 weeks after the funeral. Andrew called on a Tuesday evening and said he had been thinking about my situation and wanted to help with the practical dimensions of it. He said managing finances alone could be overwhelming and that he and Brianna would be glad to help organize the accounts and set up automatic payments. I said I appreciated it and would think about it. He said, "Grandpa, you shouldn't have to be thinking about bills right now. You should be focusing on healing." I said healing was going well and that I was managing without difficulty. He said, "Brianna has a background in financial administration. She could set everything up in an afternoon and you'd never have to think about it again." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen on Claflin Road. Through the window, I could see the backyard where Ruth had kept her garden, the beds empty now in October, the structure of them still visible. I thought about what Andrew had said and the order in which he had said it. In 30 years of auction work, I had learned that the sequence of a pitch tells you as much as its content. He had started with my vulnerability, then the solution, then Brianna's qualifications as though incidental, then my benefit. That was not a concerned grandson's conversation. That was a prepared one. I called my attorney the following morning. His name was Gerald Whitfield. He had handled Marsh Auction's legal work for 22 years and had updated my will when Ruth passed. He answered on the second ring because he always answered on the second ring. I told him about the conversation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Calvin, what does your current account structure look like?" I told him. "A checking account, 2 savings accounts, a brokerage account with the retirement proceeds, managed by a financial advisor named Robert Dunn, a small money market account kept separately." Gerald said, "Who has access to these accounts?" I said, "No one except me." He said, "Keep it that way. Don't agree to anything that changes that without calling me first." Then he said, "How much is in the brokerage account?" I told him, "Just under $900,000. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He said, "And Andrew knows roughly what you have?" I said Patricia had mentioned the retirement proceeds at a family dinner 3 years ago. Gerald said, "Don't change your behavior with Andrew. Don't indicate anything has changed. I'm going to make some inquiries." 3 days later, Andrew came by in person and raised the subject again. On the 3rd day after my attorney's call, Andrew came for dinner with Brianna. She had prepared a document describing what she called a consolidated account management structure. It proposed moving my checking, savings, and money market accounts into a joint arrangement with Andrew as co-signatory to simplify bill payment. The brokerage account was not mentioned. It was not mentioned because experienced people in financial manipulation know you do not reach for the largest asset first. You reach for the accessible ones and establish a pattern of access before reaching for what you actually want. I read the document carefully. I said I would need to review it with my attorney. Brianna said, "Of course, it's just a formality." After they left, I photographed every page and sent it to Gerald. He called the following morning. He said, "The co-signatory arrangement would give Andrew the ability to initiate transfers from all three accounts without your individual authorization. Once established, the pattern of access makes it very difficult to challenge individual transfers as unauthorized." I said, "And then comes the brokerage account." He said, "Once the smaller accounts are under joint management, the next step is usually a power of attorney, 4 to 6 weeks." He engaged a financial forensics specialist named Dr. Ann Kowalski, who had spent 20 years in banking compliance. She reviewed the proposed structure and prepared a written analysis of its implications, specific about the mechanisms that would enable unauthorized transfers and the legal exposure that would create. Gerald also contacted Robert Dunn and asked him to flag any incoming requests for account access that arrived from any source other than me directly. Robert called me the following day. He said, "Calvin, I've seen this before, more than you'd think." Meanwhile, I did what I had always done in the auction room when waiting for a situation to reveal itself fully. I was present. I was attentive. I was entirely normal. In 30 years of auction work, I had learned that the most important thing you can do when you are waiting for someone to show you who they are is to give them no reason to change their behavior. The moment you show your hand is the moment the performance stops and you lose access to the truth. Andrew came for dinner twice a week. He helped with the yard. He drove me to appointments on 3 occasions when I said my knee was troubling me, which it was not. He called every morning to ask how I was sleeping and whether I needed anything from the grocery store. He was, by every visible measure, a devoted grandson caring for a grieving grandfather. He played the role with genuine warmth, which made it harder in some ways and clearer in others. On the 22nd day, Andrew raised the account document again. He said the bank could add his name to the accounts in 20 minutes. I said I still needed to review it with Gerald. Andrew said, "Grandpa, Gerald doesn't need to be involved in something this simple." I said I preferred to have my attorney review anything I signed. Andrew did not push further that evening. On the 31st day, Brianna asked about the brokerage account. She framed it as a question about my overall financial picture, whether I was concerned about the market, whether I felt the account was being managed appropriately. I said Robert Dunn had managed it satisfactorily for 6 years. After they left, I called Gerald. I said, 31 days. He said, "They're ahead of schedule. Are you ready?" I said, "Almost. 10 more days." On the 39th day, Andrew arrived with a durable power of attorney that Brianna had prepared, comprehensive in scope. Full authority over all financial accounts, including the brokerage account. Full authority over real property transactions. Full authority to make financial decisions on my behalf in any circumstance. He set it on the kitchen table. He said, "Grandpa, this is just about making sure you're protected." I looked at the document. I looked at my grandson. I said, "Andrew, I need to think about this." He said, "We've been talking about this for over a month. I just want to take care of you." I said, "Leave it with me." He left. I photographed every page and sent it to Gerald. Gerald called within the hour. He said, "This is the document. If you sign this, he has authority over everything." I said, "I know." He said, "Calvin, are you ready?" I said, "Yes. 60 days is enough. Let's go." On the 61st day, Andrew came for what he believed was dinner. I had asked him to come at 6. I had asked him to bring Brianna. I had said I had been thinking about the document and wanted to discuss it. He arrived at 5:58, which told me he had been looking forward to this evening. I had made pot roast. Ruth's recipe, which I had been making for 46 years, which I made now for the same reason I maintained her garden. The things we make for the people we love do not stop meaning something simply because those people are gone. We ate. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, which had turned cold, Andrew's work, Patricia's children in Denver. After dinner, I cleared the table. I brought coffee. I sat down. I said, "I've been thinking about the document." Andrew said, "I'm glad, Grandpa. It really is the right thing." Brianna said, "It'll give you such peace of mind." I said, "I want to show you something first." I reached into the folder on the counter. I placed 3 documents on the table. The first was Dr. Kowalski's analysis, 6 pages, specific about the mechanisms by which the co-signatory structure would enable unauthorized transfers, specific about what the legal term for those transfers would be. Andrew looked at the first page. His expression did not change immediately. I slid the second document across. Gerald's written assessment of the power of attorney, his professional opinion that it was not a standard protective document, but a comprehensive transfer of financial authority that went far beyond what any routine instrument would require. Brianna picked up the second document. She read it faster than Andrew was reading the first. Her professional background was evident in the speed with which she understood what she was looking at. The third document was a letter from Robert Dunn confirming that on the 44th day he had received an inquiry from an individual identifying themselves as Andrew Marsh, requesting information about adding a co-owner to the account and the documentation required for a power of attorney transfer. The inquiry had arrived from an email address that was not mine. I had not known about this inquiry. Gerald had told me on the 45th day. It was the moment I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting for it. The moment when a sequence of pressures became something with a documentary record. I said, "Andrew, I have been running auction rooms since before your father was born. I have spent 30 years in rooms where people were trying to acquire things that did not belong to them. I know what that looks like from every angle." Andrew set down the first document. He looked at Brianna. She was still looking at the letter from Robert Dunn. I said, "I am not angry. I am not going to involve the police. I am not going to tell your mother what happened here unless you give me a reason to. What I am is finished." Andrew said, "Grandpa." I said, "Let me finish." He was quiet. I said, "Whatever you needed this money for, whatever is happening in your life that made this seem reasonable, you could have come to me. You could have sat at this table and told me the truth and asked for help. I would have helped you. Not with $900,000, but with what you actually needed, which I suspect is considerably less." Brianna said, "Calvin, this isn't—" I said, "Brianna, I would prefer you didn't speak right now." She stopped. I said, "Here is what happens next. You go home tonight. You think carefully about what you were doing and what it would have meant legally if I had been a different kind of person. And then you come back to this table and tell me the truth about what is actually going on." Andrew said, "Dad's business." I said, "Next time, not tonight." He nodded. He looked like he had not slept in a month. Brianna moved to gather the documents from the table. I let her pick up 2 of them and said, "Those stay here." She set them down. They left at 7:45. Andrew looked back once from the door. I nodded, not warmly, not coldly. The nod of a man who has said what needed to be said and is waiting for what comes next. I sat at the table for a long while after they left, the pot roast pan still on the stove, Ruth's recipe card in her handwriting in the box on the counter where it had always been and where it would always be as long as I was in this house. I thought about my grandson, about the summers he had spent in Salina as a teenager, sitting in the back of the auction room on a folding chair I kept behind the PA table, watching me work the room. He had asked good questions in those years. He had wanted to understand how I knew what things were worth before anyone had bid on them. I had told him that the value of something was not what someone said it was. It was what someone would actually pay for it, under honest conditions, with full information on both sides. That was the only number that meant anything in my business or in any other. He had apparently not fully absorbed the second part of that lesson, the part about full information on both sides. Andrew and Brianna came back 4 days later. The truth was smaller than the scheme built to address it. Andrew's logistics company had been struggling. He had taken a personal loan 18 months earlier to cover a business shortfall, certain he could resolve it before anyone needed to know. The loan had grown, the interest had accumulated. The total, when he finally said it out loud at my kitchen table, was $94,000. Not 900,000, 94,000. I looked at my grandson and felt something I had not expected, something close to sorrow, not for what he had tried to do, but for the distance between what he believed he needed and what the actual problem was. He had built a scheme to access nearly $1 million to address a problem that was a tenth of that. I said, $94,000. He said, yes. I said, and you decided the right way to address 94,000 was to attempt to gain control of 900,000. He said, I wasn't going to take all of it. I said, Andrew, what you were going to take is not the point. The point is what you were building toward and what it would have meant if I had signed those documents. He was quiet. I said, I am going to help you with the loan, not because what you did was acceptable, but because you are my grandson, and because $94,000 is a problem with a solution, and because your grandmother would have wanted me to help you find it. I looked at Brianna. I said, your involvement was significant. The document you prepared on day 39 was not something someone without financial training puts together. You knew exactly what you were doing. She looked at the table. I said, what I need from both of you is honesty going forward. Actual honesty. If you can give me that, we move forward. If you cannot, we are finished, and I tell Patricia everything. Andrew said, we can do that. I said, I know you can. Gerald handled the loan over the following 3 weeks. $94,000 from the short-term savings account, structured as a loan with a repayment schedule that Andrew signed without hesitation. Patricia called 3 weeks after the resolution. She said, did you know from the beginning? I said, not from the beginning, but early enough. She was quiet. Then she said, that sounds like you. I am 72 years old. I spent 30 years standing at the front of auction rooms, calling bids on things people needed, things people wanted, and things people were trying to acquire for reasons that had nothing to do with the things themselves. Andrew wanted $900,000. What he actually needed was $94,000, and someone to tell him it was a problem that could be solved. The difference between those two numbers is the distance between fear and reality. When people are afraid, they expand the problem to the size of their fear. They build solutions for the fear rather than for the problem. The solutions built for fear are always larger and more dangerous than the solutions built for the actual problem. I spent 60 days watching my grandson build a solution for his fear. I spent those same 60 days building a solution for his actual problem. Mine was smaller, and it worked. You do not have to pretend not to notice. You do not have to confront before you are ready. You do not have to do anything loudly. Pay attention. Document what you observe. Move quietly. Prepare thoroughly. Wait for the moment when the full shape of what is happening has revealed itself completely, and then decide what you actually want. I wanted my grandson back more than I wanted him punished. I wanted the conversation we finally had more than any version of victory that would have foreclosed it. The brokerage account is still in my name. Andrew makes his monthly repayment on the 1st of every month. He calls on Sundays. The calls are more honest now in every way that matters. Ruth's recipe box is on the counter. I made pot roast last Sunday. Andrew came for dinner. He did not bring documents. Tell me in the comments. Has someone ever mistaken your patience for weakness? I want to hear from you.